Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, where I'll be talking about what to expect from a regulatory inspection. But first, a quick introduction. My name's Ian White, and I'm one of the executive directors here at NSF. However, it's my previous role that resulted me being volunteered to deliver this presentation. So a little bit more about that. I spent about 17 years in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, during which time I worked on products as diverse as traditional herbal remedies through to monoclonal antibodies. I then joined the MHRA as an inspector, where I worked for about 7 years, conducting inspections around the world on behalf of both the MHRA and the EMA. During this time, I had the opportunity to work alongside various other agencies, including the US FDA, Taiwanese FDA, TGA, Health Canada, and ANVISA. The MHRA works slightly differently to a lot of other agencies. Rather than being an inspector that can go out and inspect any and every type of manufacturing site, inspectors at the MHRA gain accreditations in specific areas. For example, non-sterile, sterile, biologicals, medical gases, specials, and investigational medicinal products. I think I can safely claim I was the only inspector to have been accredited in both traditional herbal remedies and biologicals. But in my opinion, having worked across such a diverse product range, it gave me a far more robust understanding of risk. As expert inspector, I was seconded to the Vaccines Task Force at the height of the pandemic and was heavily involved in the deployment of vaccines under Reg 174 in the UK and wider global efforts to ensure access. I eventually decided to move on from the MHRA and left at the end of 2022 to join NSF. But enough about me, back to the subject in hand, what to expect from a regulatory inspection. And during this webinar, I'll touch upon the following points. What happens when an inspector comes to site? What do they look for? What are the common pitfalls? And what happens when they leave? Okay, so what happens when an inspector arrives on site? Well, let's just take a step back before we discuss that aspect, because there's a really important step before that. Unless it's an unannounced inspection, most authorities require you to provide some information up front. In the case of the MHRA, that's via a pre-inspection compliance report. This is a really important opportunity, especially if it's an inspector that hasn't been to site before, to start to build the relationship. The responses to the questions in the report and the way they are completed give the inspector a useful insight into the culture on site. And you're going to hear me mention culture multiple times during this webinar. It's an aspect of inspections that's becoming increasingly important. So it's worth considering. You may have unconsciously biased the inspector's first impression before they even arrive on site. Increasingly, to maximize the effectiveness on their time on site, inspectors are also requesting additional information up front. This may be spreadsheets of deviations, OOS investigations, change controls, validation master plans, etc. The purpose of this is to allow them to do some degree of data analysis up front and come prepared with specific examples of investigations they want to review. Again, the way you respond to these requests goes to building that relationship and is another good indicator of culture on site. The type of data analysis inspectors perform isn't a secret. In fact, it's been openly shared at one of the MHRA symposium. And if you search YouTube for Ewan Norton, MHRA, you'll find a video where he explains what inspectors are looking for. I recommend having a watch and seeing if you can use the same techniques in reviewing your data. The opening meeting. Okay, for a routine inspection, the notification letter will request an opening meeting. This is an important opportunity for the leadership team to make a positive impression and again to demonstrate the culture on site. As an inspector, I wanted to see the whole leadership team involved because, as Chapter 1 EU GMP states, it's the senior management that are ultimately responsible. If only the quality team turned up, I'd start to form the opinion that quality was seen as owning quality, and of course that's not the case. The opening meeting is a really good opportunity for the site to sell itself, to talk about investment and/or changes that are being made to the on-site. It always bemused me as an inspector if I started to identify concerns around the condition of an area on site, only then to be told that they'd identified it internally and were in the process of addressing it. By that point, you're already on the back foot and in the position of having to change the impression in the inspector's mind. A more contentious point, and one that really reflects an open, forward-looking culture, during the opening meeting or immediately afterwards, any significant quality events or trends that have been identified. In my opinion, I truly believe the site are better controlling that narrative from the off, rather than the inspector finding it themselves and then you having to explain it. Remember, inspectors do this for a living. The likelihood is they'll find those issues you'd rather they didn't. If an inspection is executed at no notice, the inspector will generally give reasonable time for you to pull leadership together in order to deliver the opening meeting, outlining the legal basis for the inspection. Following the opening meeting, inspectors fully appreciate that people have their routine roles to be getting back to, and generally, they're happy to be left to get on with their job of executing the inspection alongside a host of an additional support. Following the opening meeting, inspectors fully appreciate that people have their routine roles to be getting back to, and generally, they're happy to be left to get on with their job of executing the inspection alongside a host and additional support such as scribes and runners. Just as an aside, please don't call the audit support team the war room. Believe it or not, inspectors don't turn up to declare war, and again, it's an indicator of culture. The inspection process. Okay. I can tell you every inspector I know hates being actively managed. We know when it's happening, and for most of us, it just becomes a challenge. So my advice is don't do it. During one inspection, I was at an organisation that I'd previously worked for. In the opening meeting, I told them not to do some of the things that I know they do. For example, try and actively manage the inspection by means of slowing down documents coming into the room, calling SMEs in for every subject who we then had to wait on, telling me where we would be going during the inspection and when we could go, and wanting me to take me to the furthest point on site for lunch every day. That stopped mid-morning of the first day when I cleared the room and requested that the head of site and the head of quality joined me for a little chat. Invariably, this type of behaviour doesn't end well, but it's not the inspector that suffers for it. So what do they look for? Well, the answer to that is really quite simple. They're looking to ensure that you're operating in compliance with the latest version of the legislation and that you're operating within a state of control. But how do they go about that? Well, they do it by a variety of means, and it's true that there's quite significant differences across the various agencies. The MHRA, for example, places significant importance on speaking directly to those individuals executing the role. And whilst the inspector will, of course, want to see that SOPs are in place and in use, they also want to walk away from the conversation with the feeling that the individual has been well trained, is competent, and understands their role. As such, I do not believe training your operatives to answer, "I'd refer to my SOP" in answer to every question is a positive approach. MHRA and EMA inspectors also dedicate a significant amount of time to simply observing. And in cases where there's two inspectors, you'll often see one inspector taking the lead whilst they're out in the facility to ask questions, being active in understanding process flows, etc., whilst the other inspector takes a step back, allowing them simply to stand and observe. Inspectors will routinely want to gown up and go into areas to watch operations in person. This can include Grade B if visibility doesn't allow thorough review of activities from outside this area. So ensure that you have appropriately sized gowns and gloves in stock. I'm a 5XL in Japan, which always makes me chuckle. We like to open vessels up and check for things like rouging of surfaces and integrity of seals. We'll often ask for tools to help with this. And in the case of checking the cleanliness of a vessel, they'll be the same tools that we'd expect to be in use during an operator's visual inspection. So if they can't be accessed in a timely manner, the inspector will naturally come to the conclusion that they're not actually in use on a day-to-day basis. Make sure you've covered the basics. It sounds simple, but I can't tell you how many times I've come across things like unlabeled containers, incorrect equipment status cards, or paperwork that's been completed ahead of time to save a few seconds when it's actually needed. Inspectors will generally give you some advance notice of their intentions, so make sure someone has walked the floor ahead of them just to make sure those silly things are caught and make the inspector work for those deficiencies, rather than hand them over on a silver platter. Inspectors will ask what appear to be stupid questions, but I can assure you, those questions come from things they've seen elsewhere. They can also often be the question that opened Pandora's box, so be careful in answering them. Equally, as a host, you may well hear an inspector asking the same question multiple times. I can guarantee this is on purpose, and they're looking for consistency. They will, of course, look at elements of the PQS to ensure they are aligned with regulatory expectations and that you, as a site, are operating in adherence to what you've stated. This is often where the state of control element comes into play. For example, a deviation is being investigated and closed out in a timely manner. Is the consistency in the investigation of OOS results? Is the change control system under control, or are timelines consistently being missed and change controls remaining open? Please do note, whilst inspectors understand that there are instances where deadlines are missed or timelines need to be extended, they should be the exception, not the rule. Having a formal process to extend timelines does not give you a get out of jail card for missing the majority of your original timelines. Remember though, the inspector isn't the expert in your operations, you are. Inspections are only ever a sampling process. They have an awful lot to get through and very little time to do it. So, as an inspector, if I was at a site that had provided me with a thorough compliance report, had provided me with the information I'd asked for beforehand, had delivered a positive opening meeting and demonstrated an open culture, if I then walked into an area and it looked in good condition, well organised, the individuals I spoke to could talk me through what they were doing and demonstrate an understanding of why, I would very quickly decide to move on and see if I could find risk elsewhere. That nicely leads us on to what are the common pitfalls that companies make during an inspection? Well, I've already touched on a couple. Not communicating improvements up front and being overly aggressive in managing the inspection. But in my opinion, the most frustrating failure where sites could easily have avoided a deficiency was through not using their PQS effectively. In general, unless it's a significant patient safety issue, or unless it's only been addressed after the inspection notification letter has been received, inspectors do not give deficiencies where events have been identified and documented within the PQS. Having said that, I can't tell you how many times I've identified an issue during an inspection only for the site to turn around and say, yes, we're aware of that, but there's nothing documented in the PQS. Inspectors can only inspect what's within the PQS. A project plan sitting on someone's personal drive is of no benefit. The same goes for uncontrolled action logs from things such as management review. So please, use your PQS. The other pitfall that's far more common than it should be is simply not having a system in place to identify and assess upcoming changes in the regulatory landscape in a timely manner to ensure compliance. And just for everyone's benefit, no, you cannot risk assess yourself out of a stipulated requirement. And that's now been clarified in ICH Q9 R1, which states quality risk management should not be used in a manner where decisions are made that justify a practice that would otherwise, in accordance with regulations and/or guidance, be deemed unacceptable. Other pitfalls include not reacting to messages that your data is giving you. I can assure you, it's an uncomfortable seat to be in, trying to explain to an inspector why the management team haven't taken action to reverse negative trends when they're quite clear to see. Storyboards. Now, I think storyboards can be quite useful, but only by exception, and as an aid for people to come in and explain the most complex of issues. If every SME comes in with a storyboard, then as an inspector, I start to lose confidence in training and competence. And once an inspector reaches that point, they're going to go and start digging far more thoroughly in that area. So please use them accordingly. Preparing individuals to speak to inspectors. Now, as inspectors, we're aware that people can be extremely nervous when they have to speak to us, and we will do what we can to help people relax. But managers and training teams need to play a role in this too. If you're going to identify SMEs to come in and present, then make sure they've received the appropriate coaching and mentoring to prepare them to present both themselves and the site in the best possible manner. And please, make sure people know that if they can't answer the question, then responding with, I'd refer the matter to my supervisor or manager, or I'd check my procedure, is perfectly acceptable. Trust is slow to build, but extremely quick to undermine. And again, you don't want to be sat in front of an inspector as they remind you that misleading or lying to an inspector is a criminal offence, even if it originated from good intentions. The last point I'd like to mention here is around the increasing use of electronic systems. Inspectors are, in general, more than happy to review documents electronically, be that an electronic document system or something like TrackWise. But if you're going to put a laptop in front of an inspector, please make sure you've disabled the notifications. As an inspector, I had a number of instances where I was looking at something on the screen when a Teams message popped up that they really didn't want me seeing. So what happens when the inspectors leave site? Well, I can't talk about what happens without first talking about the closing meeting. In the unfortunate event that a critical deficiency is found, the inspection will effectively cease until the impact of that issue is thoroughly understood. and it's entirely likely the rest of the inspection won't happen at that point in time. The subsequent process will be explained in detail, so I'm not going to cover that here. Routinely, at the closing meeting, the inspector will read through the deficiencies they've identified. All the agencies that I've worked with operate in a transparent manner and will make you aware of deficiencies as and when they find them. As such, there really shouldn't be any surprises come the closing meeting. It's vital that people listen to what's being said at the closing meeting. It's your last chance to ensure the deficiencies are factually correct. But please note, it's not an opportunity to reopen discussion around whether something's a deficiency or not. That opportunity has passed, and quite honestly, it's really frustrating when someone who hasn't been involved in the inspection turns up for the closing meeting and then wants to argue everything that's said. I recommend having a scribe in the room, which enables the core team to actively listen. Invariably, when delivering closing meetings, I'd look up and everyone would have their heads down, busy scribbling everything I was saying. You'll receive the inspection letter within days, but you won't have the opportunity to listen to what's being said again. As a result of people not listening, I'd say about 75% of responses I received clearly hadn't heard the information I'd delivered at the closing meeting, and as such, hadn't responded as I'd requested. And please note, inspectors can escalate an inspection outcome to a higher risk rating if they don't receive robust compliant CAPA. For the MHRA, inspectors are routinely required to have the post-inspection letter out within 2 weeks, though it's often well within that. So the response itself, depending on the outcome of the inspection, i.e. the breakdown of deficiencies, there's a staggered response time for the site to respond with its action plan. For a Type 1 letter, sites are required to respond within 4 weeks. For a Type 2, where the inspector has identified concerns but has not hit the threshold for escalation, it's typically 4 weeks but can be reduced. For a Type 3 letter, typically where the site has been referred to the compliance management team, the site is required to respond within 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the situation. And for a Type 4 letter, where a site has been referred to the inspection action group, it's typically 1 week to respond. Deficiencies are typically written so that it's the top line that's the actual deficiency, followed by the evidence that the inspector has found. I explained this at every closing meeting, but this was where most sites failed. When responding, the CAPA needs to address the deficiency. It's not simply the examples identified that need to be fixed. If you only address the examples, the inspector will simply return the response and tell you to try again. That will only happen a couple of times before the inspector considers escalating the inspection outcome. But equally, make the most of the time you're given. There are no rewards for getting your corrective action plans back to the inspector quickly. They would far rather a well thought out, achievable plan that holistically addresses the deficiencies at a site level. Please keep the responses succinct and to the point. I used to find it really frustrating when I'd get responses of over 100 pages where sites would again try and explain what they're currently doing and why they don't think it's a deficiency. And then at the very end, bolt on a single line with their CAPA. Inspectors can and do return overly long responses. Identify appropriate timelines, and really important, if you decide to change what you've committed to or the timeline, please communicate that to the inspector. They tend to take a very dim view if they return to site and find you've not done what you said you were going to or taken significantly longer to do it. After the inspection, once the dust settles, it's my experience and certainly the way that I worked, inspectors tend to only capture the most significant issues, or those they feel need addressing as priority, as actual deficiencies on the post-inspection letter. They'll then use the inspection report to capture borderline or less significant matters. Sites tend to focus on the post-inspection letter and forget about the report. I can assure you, you'll only get one bite of that cherry, and if an inspector returns to site and you've not addressed something they captured in the report, it will go down as a deficiency on the second visit. So make sure you revisit that inspection report, go through it, learn the lessons. Sites invariably now also have scribes, capturing the various discussions over the course of the inspection. Go back to those notes and look for the opportunities to make improvements. Additionally, make sure knowledge from one site is shared with other sites within the organisation. I used to find it really frustrating when I'd give a deficiency to one site, only to find the exact same thing at another one of their sites. It sounds obvious, but it was a regular occurrence. And finally, keep communication channels open with your inspector. For the MHRA, make use of interim compliance reports to update them on significant changes, and consider speaking to your inspector in the event of serious quality events. I can assure you, the vast majority of inspectors that I've had the honour of working with are not there to be the enemy. They want to help, and ultimately, we all want safe, effective product going out to patients. So that's me done, folks. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you found some of the insights useful. And if there are any questions, please do drop us an email at the address healthsciences@nsf.org. If there's a takeaway from today, I'd say it's that trust is hugely important. As an inspector, if I felt I could trust a site whilst I was there with them, then I could trust them to do the right thing when I wasn't. But trust can be very quickly lost. The second point would be around culture and how we can expect to see it playing an increasingly important role moving forward. And for those of you that are interested in that aspect, please have a read of the white paper that NSF have published last year on its quality maturity model. Thank you.